It's my privilege to introduce the essayist and psychoanalyst Adam Phillips. Adam Phillips, his talk will be entitled On Vacancies of Attention. Adam Phillips was formerly principal psychologist at the Charing Cross Hospital in London, is now an analyst in private practice. The New Yorker has described him as Britain's foremost psychoanalytic writer. He's the author of many books, from his first sort of classic, really, account of Winnicott, which I think is still the best single account of Winnicott there is, to most recently a book entitled Unforbidden Pleasures. Adam is a regular contributor to London Review of Books, New York Times, The Observer, Raritan, Salmagundi, The Threepenny Review, is often to be heard on the radio too, if you live in Britain. I am going to keep this introduction brief. It has to be brief because I admire Adam's essays so much that it's really hard to say anything about them. But I'll try and say something, which is that there's a line in Adam's essay, Narcissism For and Against, which is a wonderful essay, in which Adam points out the true fact that forms of closure are easier to describe than forms of openness. And in the context of an essay on narcissism, this is, of course, about openness or closure to the world. It's something that we've been talking about today, something we're talking about broadly under the rubric of attention. But it strikes me that's very true. And Adam's essays are, in the Arnoldian term, adequate to their form. That is to say, as essays, they really do what everything you'd ever wanted an essay to do does. I mean, the essay is an experiment, and you do feel like, when you've read one of his essays, that your view on the world has been changed. And I think the greatest essays in what we might call the essay tradition do this. And I was reading through, again, Adam's work over the last few weeks, and I was trying to think of a clever or adequate formulation for describing what they're often about. And I think one of the things they're often about is something very, very important. That is to say, they're very often about openness to the world, what we might call facing reality. And in a sense, they are, in the sort of Freudian line of contribution, a great resource for thinking about that difficult question in Freudian psychoanalysis, which Freud called the reality principle. And if it's more to be just something you kind of bash your head up against, if it's going to be something richer, if it's going to be something we're all going to enjoy, then there isn't really a more important subject to talk about. And there's no one I know who talks about it better. So I'll pass the floor to him.
This is the end of the day. Can everybody hear? This is the end of the day, so I suggest that you listen to this with free-floating attention, as in, don't bother to concentrate. This is called On Vacancies of Attention, and the epigraph to the first section is from Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's the end of a sentence. To be observed, to be attended to be taken notice of with sympathy, complacency, and approbation. In 1920, Freud added a passage from Tristram Shandy to the chapter Symptomatic and Chance Actions in the Psychopathology of Everyday Life. Quote, in the field of symptomatic acts too, he wrote, in one of many such acknowledgements in his work, psychoanalytic observation must concede priority to imaginative writers. It can only repeat what they have said long ago, end of quote. If psychoanalysis can only repeat what imaginative writers have said long ago, it's as though lessons haven't been learned, that we've been insufficiently attentive readers, or that we're unduly resistant to the provocations of imaginative writers. It's psychoanalytic observation that must concede priority, presumably, to the observation of what he calls imaginative writers. It's the quality of attention and the need for repetition, and the links between attention and repetition, that exercises Freud here, and indeed in the psychopathology of everyday life. The subtitle of his book, On Forgetfulness, Slips of the Tongue, Inadvertent Actions, Superstitions and Mistakes, is a catalogue of inattention and its discontents. After his preamble, Freud quotes something that he says, quote, was drawn to his attention from Sterne's novel. I'm not at all surprised, Tristram's father says in volume 6, that Gregory of Nyszanzam, upon observing the hasty and untoward gestures of Julian, should foretell he would one day become an apostate, or that St. Ambrose should turn his amanuensis out of doors because of an indecent motion of his head, which went backwards and forwards like a flail, or that Democritus should conceive Protagoras to be a scholar from seeing his bind up a faggot and thrusting it, as he did, the small twigs inwards. There are 1,000 unnoticed openings, continued my father, which let a penetrating eye at once into a man's soul. And I maintain it, added he, that a man of sense does not lay down his hat on coming into a room or take it up in going out of it, but something escapes which discovers him. End of quote. What has been drawn to Freud's attention, that he's now drawing to our attention, is Sterne's account of paying a certain kind of attention. Attention to, quote, the 1,000 openings which let a penetrating eye at once into a man's soul. And by the same token to what may be missed either by inattention or by not paying this kind of attention, to the consequences of the not noticings of everyday life. But without the penetrating eye, there are no openings. It's the penetrating eye that is the precondition in Sterne's overtly sexual image for such openings. And Freud's book is an account of the new penetrating eye and penetrating ear of the psychoanalyst. In retrospect, we can say Freud realized that his patients were in search of a new kind of attention for their inattentions. If you believed, as Freud was beginning to do, in the value and efficacy of psychoanalytic treatment, you could say that their symptoms were provocations that had misfired, that they were unconsciously addressed or in search of a different kind of doctor. And this new doctor, as we shall see, was defined by the quality of his attention and of his inattention. Freud is describing in these early formative books, the essays on sexuality, the joke book, Interpreting Dreams, and the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, what he takes to be a new kind of attention, psychoanalytic attention, an interpretive attention that is in the service of telling and useful descriptions of unconscious motivation. But what is perhaps of interest in Freud's use of Tristram Shandy, and that Freud doesn't comment on, is that Sterne's examples are about predicting the future, whereas Freud's examples in the Psychopathology of Everyday Life are about predicting the past. They are conjectural descriptions of desires from the past that are active in a person's present life. Slips are uncompleted provocations. In actuality, Freud's new science makes very few, if any, predictive claims about a person's future. Psychoanalytic treatment was about the unpredictable consequences of certain evolving acknowledgements. All psychoanalysis could reveal was the nature, which was in part the history, of the patient's desire. In and of itself, the psychoanalytic attention given to this could not, by definition, disclose anything about the patient's future. Tristram's father suggests, not unlike Freud, that there's virtually nothing a person does that is not remarkably revealing. Quote, a man of sense does not lay down his hat in coming into a room or take it up in going out of it, but something escapes which discovers him. A man of sense because, as 18th century sensible creatures, what people do makes sense. And even though by implication we may be guarded, something escapes which discovers us and which reveals us. As though whether we want to or not, we make something of ourselves known, we give ourselves away. And this giving ourselves away is a making sense. Sense can be made of it, and it can make sense. Our inattention invites attention. So we're more communal, more communicative, more potentially in contact with each other than we're always aware of or want to know about. As though what Freud calls symptomatic acts, many of which are, of course, acts of apparent inattention, like slips and bungled acts, are a kind of love test to the world, a testing of attention and engagement, as though symptomatic acts were like jokes, something people either get or they don't. as though acts of inattention are courting attention and are themselves provocations. Or at least a question is raised by Freud. Are so-called symptomatic acts an unconscious attempt to provoke a certain kind of attention, or does a certain kind of attention make them symptomatic acts? Are they provocations by intention, as it were, however unconscious, or does a certain kind of attention turn them into provocations? When is provocation in the eye of the beholder, or does it expose the eye of the beholder? Freud is interested in the mistakes people make and of what can be made of what people make. Clearly, a slip of the tongue made while buying a newspaper is different from a slip made to one's analyst. And the phrase, a man of sense, of course meant something different in the 18th century than it does or could now. One way of thinking about this is to wonder what happens to all the symptomatic acts, the huge majority, that are actually unattended to. What happens in Sterne's language if something escapes which discovers a person and nobody notices, which happens all the time? The pragmatic answer is they go on doing it or find new ways of doing it in the hope that someone will notice it. The dismaying answer is they give up, that a joke won't amuse you unless it does. In Freud's story, it's worth noticing, and we'll come back to this, that the privileging of recognition doesn't always tell us very much or enough about where it is assumed recognition might lead. This recognition that, of course, depends on a certain kind of attention. It's been easy to believe that underlying our instincts, our putative needs and wants, and indeed the precondition for them, is in fact a need for recognition. Needs without anyone able to acknowledge them are torments, provocations that misfire. But what Freud adds, and not only Freud, is that we're seeking recognition of our inattentions, and that inattention is itself a way of seeking recognition. Inattention, as every child and parent knows, is its own kind of provocation. If Freud was a pragmatist, we could say that he was interested in the uses of inattention. Western modernity, since the 19th century, Jonathan Crary writes in Suspensions of Perception, quote, has demanded that individuals define and shape themselves in terms of a capacity for paying attention. That is, for a disengagement from a broader field of attraction, whether visual or auditory, for the sake of isolating or focusing on a reduced number of stimuli, end of quote. Attention is ineluctably selective. It's made possible by inattention. As if by the same token, as Crary intimates, individuals define and shape themselves by what they fail or refuse to pay attention to. And indeed, it will be this question of the reasons for inattention, the reasons being as much of a provocation as the inattentions, that Freud addresses. The question of whether and to what extent these inattentions are refusals or failures or incapacities, or indeed provocations, and what these inattentions might be in the service of. If, as Crary writes, quote, the articulation of a subject in terms of attentive capacities simultaneously disclosed a subject incapable of conforming to such disciplinary imperatives, we're left wondering why impossible attentive capacities might be demanded, and what attention has to do with conformity. What Crary calls attentive capacities conforming to disciplinary imperatives always involves the imposition of an essentialism. There is something to which, because of who we supposedly are, we should be attending. Certainly in Freud's increasingly essentialist view, there is civilization and its discontents, because civilization makes us pay attention to the wrong things. And when we pay attention to the right things, our instinctual life, we may increase our pleasure and by doing so increase our suffering. But before the later and abiding disillusionments of civilization and its discontents, and while Freud was still in the process of becoming the committed essentialist he turned out to be, the younger Freud's question was, what are the preconditions for inattention? And then, to what can inattention lead us? One thing inattention could lead to, of course, was psychoanalysis. It was the provocations of inattention, what kind of attention the inattentions of his patients called up in him, that Freud would elaborate on. Psychoanalysis, as we shall see, was to be a language that cultivated an interest in and a commitment to inattention, and the kind of attention and inattention we can bring to it. So to put it in another kind of language, to talk about attention is also to talk about the two familiar foundations of liberalism, the supposedly autonomous, independent individual and the supposedly free market. Psychoanalysis asks, what does attention depend upon? And what is the exchange that is attention what is the exchange that is attention possibly be free of? But I want first to talk about and return to Tristram Shandy by way of Johnson's contemporary fable Rasselas for earlier and instructive ways of describing the uses of inattention, ways that surface, I think, unwittingly or wittingly in the work of Marion Milner, a member of what became known as the Middle or Independent Group in British psychoanalysis. And we should perhaps bear in mind that it was famously Johnson's view that Sterne's provocation would never hold our attention. Quote, "Nothing odd will do for long," Johnson remarked in 1776. Tristram Shandy did not last. The epigraph to the second section is Johnson's definition of the word odd in his dictionary. Odd, not noticed, not taken into the common account, unheeded, strange, unaccountable, fantastical, particular, unlucky, unlikely, in appearance, improper. Samuel Johnson's The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia of 1759, begins with a description of a palace in a wide and fruitful valley where the emperor's children live until the order of succession calls them to the throne. It's described as an idyll in which, quote, "the blessings of nature were collected and its evils extracted and excluded." A kind of 18th century Orientalist gated community. It's a place of peace, serenity, and beauty without challenge or threat. Once a year, the emperor would visit his children, and during the 8 days of his visit, quote, "everyone that resided in the valley was required to propose whatever might contribute to make seclusion pleasant, to fill up the vacancies of attention, and lessen the tediousness of time. Every desire was immediately granted. All the artifices of pleasure were called to gladden the festivity," end of quote. It is clear that all is not well in the valley, that something must be lacking if there is a need to lessen the tediousness of time, if there are vacancies of attention. There is some lesson in this lessening that seems so urgent. The hope is that the artifices of pleasure will do the trick, and yet each year the emperor returns, the malady is once again addressed, but it never goes away. It is, of course, the danger of living apparently satisfied in an over-organized environment that Johnson is so pointedly alerting us to at the very beginning of the story. The terrors of some version of pastoral, or some version of social engineering in which we are entombed in our supposed preferences and ideals. What is absent in what is called notably the happy valley is the tension of desiring, the freedom to think about what is missing and what might be missed. Or as Johnson suggests in what we might think of wrongly as a more contemporary vocabulary, enjoyment can be used to preempt desire. Quote, this is from Rasselas, "I've already enjoyed too much. Give me something to desire," the Prince Rasselas declares in a chapter entitled "The Wants of Him That Wants Nothing." It is the ways in which satisfaction can sabotage desire that Johnson wants us to think about in his moral tale. And he connects this, as we do in the modern vocabulary of psychoanalysis, with attention and its vacancies. So much depends on where our attention is. If acculturation is, among other things, the organizing of attention, or the organizing of desire as the organizing of attention, then there is a tension, as Johnson intimates, between what we are supposed to attend to and what we find ourselves wanting to attend to. We have an emperor, sages, and artifices of pleasure to help us with our vacancies of attention. Johnson, the only great writer who wrote a dictionary and so provokes a unique attention to his words, defines vacant as empty, void, but also as free, unencumbered, as, quote, thoughtless, empty of thought, but also as being at leisure. Rasselas the Prince has to leave the happy valley. Quote, "He resolved to obtain some knowledge of the ways of men, the one thing he couldn't find or find out about in the happy valley. It was," Johnson writes, "Rasselas's curiosity, a source of inexhaustible inquiry, that got him out. A desire for a certain kind of knowledge, a knowledge of other people, strangers to the happy valley, and a question then about why such knowledge was wanted. Freedom, or rather change, is described as a shift in attention, and vacancies of attention are the preconditions for change. And so we need to be alert," Johnson intimates, "to the ways in which systems or regimes or vocabularies try to preempt vacancies of attention, and to what kind of vacancies of attention they tend to incite. Vacancies of attention is a phrase worth attending to, not least because it suggests that leisure, with all its economic associations, that at leisure, unencumbered, we are in a different kind of elsewhere. In such vacancies, significant realizations may occur. Gaps in knowledge may be revelatory or inspiring or confounding. Other desires may float into view. And because it makes us wonder what we're doing when we are filling up the vacancies of our attention, and what attention might be or be like, how we picture it, if it requires filling or can empty. And if filling is, as Johnson defines it in his dictionary, quote, to make full, to engage, to employ, what then is empty or unengaged or unemployed attention? What are we doing, if anything, in the vacancies of our attention? These are, of course, also the questions that will eventually inspire psychoanalytic inquiry. But it's almost as though Johnson is wondering here what or where attention is when it isn't there, or more pragmatically, what happens to attention, to what he calls desire, when there is nothing to organize it, nothing sufficient for it to focus on. Once we're invited to imagine the absence of attention, attention as something that can be absent or absent itself, attention itself becomes more perplexing. The vacancies of attention suggest that there is, as it were, more than one of them, and indeed that our attention may be also beyond our control, or the control might be the wrong word, as it often is, to use about our attention. The faux optimism at the beginning of Rasselas is that with the arrival of the emperor, these vacancies of attention can be filled. As it turns out, it is only Rasselas's curiosity that can do the trick. An act of curiosity, Johnson defines in his dictionary as, quote, a nice experiment. To be curious, Johnson writes, is, quote, to be attentive to, exact, nice, subtle. There are vacancies of attention, and there is the nice experiment of curiosity to which they can lead. To attend, Johnson writes, is, quote, to fix the mind upon, with both meanings of it in play. The mind is repaired and organized, calmed or stilled by concentrating on something external. And then there is the other meaning of attend, which is somehow complementary. Quote, to wait on, to accompany as an inferior or a servant. The mind that always runs the risk for Johnson of becoming unfixed, unmoored, depends like a servant on his master, the external world that he serves, a world created by God and to which he must attend. The external world keeps us sane. The internal world for Johnson is a potential fall into madness. Johnson's terror is the tyrannies of the secluded mind. So attention for Johnson is something he must always keep his eye on. An attender, Johnson writes in his dictionary, is, quote, a companion, an associate. The critic Christian Thorne instructively links Johnson's filling up of the vacancies of attention to lessen the tediousness of time in Rasselas with Sterne's contemporary notion of the hobby horse in Tristram Shandy. It's a useful link because Sterne is as preoccupied with states of attention as his contemporary Johnson was, preoccupied by the ways in which we can and cannot, in some new sense, choose both the object and the quality of our attention, and this being both a modern and a provoking preoccupation. Digression, as Matt Bevis has written, being Tristram's signature tune and the life of the book, another name for inattention and distraction. Sterne's Uncle Toby and his absurd and absorbing obsession with a war he fought in and a wound he suffered, quote, the wound in my Uncle Toby's groin, which he received at the siege of Namur, made famous the traditional notion of the hobby horse and its provoking history. It's not incidental here that a hobby horse is at once a self-cure and a consequence of a wound and a war. And a hobby horse, by definition, organizes and absorbs the attention of its rider, and itself provokes attention. A hobby horse, like a symptom, is a rule by which other people must abide. Clearly, for Sterne, the whole notion of the hobby horse raises the question about the paying of attention, and of course about our being able to tell the difference between what may and may not be a hobby horse. In a letter of January 1760, Sterne pursues the divided and dividing question about hobby horses, and so about how a man might be defined by the nature of his attention. Quote, the ruling passions and the wanderings of the heart are the very things which mark and distinguish a man's character, in which I would as soon leave out a man's head as his hobby horse. Quote. Tell me what attracts or absorbs a person's attention, and I will tell you who they are, would be one way of saying this, though not quite Sterne's. Sterne's modern editor, Melvin New, glosses Sterne's hobby horse of a man's character with an excerpt from one of Sterne's sermons. To understand character, Sterne writes about Herod, we must, quote, distinguish the principal and ruling passion which leads the character, and separate that from the other parts of it. We often think of ourselves inconsistent creatures when we are the furthest from it, and all the variety of shapes and contradictory appearances we put on are, in truth, but so many different attempts to gratify the same governing appetite, end of quote. The consistency of character Sterne proposes here is all to do with consistency and abiding forms of attention, the same governing appetite, the same object of desire. We're not distracted, we just look as though we are, Sterne suggests. There is a pattern even in our inattentions. Vacancies of attention are absorptions elsewhere, as intent and intense as lusts and pastimes. We're not divided against ourselves, but far more of a piece than we can let ourselves know. We're not in any sense decentered, but just in states of repeating and repeated displacement. Our attention is only for more of the same. The idea of being decentered defends us against the tyranny of our focus. Sterne suggests we are always already filled with attention to what he calls the same governing appetite, whether or not it's deemed to be of value. So in what sense can we or do we choose in the telling phrase to pay attention? Johnson's question in Rasselas, like Sterne's question in Tristram Shandy, is to what should we give our attention and to what do we give our attention? But Sterne's other question in Tristram Shandy is how seriously should we and can we take such questions? Tristram Shandy, a parody of sages and a sceptical celebration of the artifices of pleasure, is itself, as Tristram tells us, the story of a cock and a bull. Lord, said my mother, Tristram Shandy famously ends, what is all this story about? A cock and a bull, said Yorick, and one of the best of its kind I ever heard. The kind being, in Sterne's editor's words, a story without direction, rambling, idle, often incredible, like free association. Sterne is making us wonder which stories, and perhaps particularly essentialist stories about character, are not cock and bull stories, i.e. lacking a certain coherence and plausibility and point. Cock and bull stories like Tristram Shandy absorb our attention, and Sterne wants us to wonder whether that is the point or the problem. What are we doing when we pay attention to the attention people pay to their hobby horses? Hobby horses that are, in all but name, a species of conversion. The hobby horse, akin in some ways to certain psychoanalytic accounts of so-called perverse states of mind, is absorption with a view to the stopping of time, as though a hobby horse was a form of arrested development, as arrested attention, a refuge from the future. And it is indeed this link between deprivation and attention, that Johnson refers to as vacancies of attention, that Sterne also picks up on. As though it is deprivation itself that stimulates, that both forces and fixes our attention, and can make us attend to our attention. Attention being the form and the medium of our desire, prompted by the felt lack of something. Attention is given to felt absences. In chapter 17 of book 6 of Tristram Shandy, Sterne has a passage about writing and attention. And once again, as with Johnson, it's interestingly the language of fullness and emptiness, appetite and deprivation, that Sterne has recourse to. Tristram writes, he tells us, quote, one half full and the other fasting, or writes it all full and corrects it fasting, or writes it fasting and corrects it full. When I write full, he tells us, I write free from the cares as well as the terrors of the world. I count not the number of my scars, nor does my fancy go forth into dark entries and byways to antedate my stabs. But when I compose fasting, 'tis a different history. I pay the world all possible attention and respect, and have as great a share while it lasts of that understrapping virtue of discretion as the best of you. End of quote. When he's full, he's carefree and unfrightened. When he's fasting, it is, and perhaps he has, a different history. He does count his scars, go forth into dark entries and by corners to antedate, i.e. explain his wounds. And this is what he calls paying the world all possible attention and respect. When he writes full, he's not paying this attention and respect. Fasting, deprivation, creates this attention and respect for the world. And what is then attended to is wounds and cares and terrors. But what is notable about Sterne is that he doesn't privilege either kind of writing, but needs both. It is the combination of the carefree and the terrorized that works for him. Quote, "Betwixt both, I write a careless kind of a civil, nonsensical, good-humoured, Shandian book, which will do all your hearts good, and all your heads too, provided you understand it." What is required in the writing, though, is paying the world all possible attention and respect, and also not doing so. The inattention prized alongside the attention. Whereas with the hobby horse, there's very little paying the world all possible attention and respect. And in the all too familiar phrase, paying attention, Sterne reminds us that attention costs us something, and we are likely and prone in a culture of money to liken attention to money, and so to be thinking of investments and returns, profit and loss, gains and drawbacks. And by the same token, as it were, to wonder what attention might be like if it was not like paying for something, paying with something, if it was not a kind of investment, if, say, attention was more like affection or desire or love. The attentive, terrified, wounded, and explaining self is not realer or more significant for Sterne than the inattentive, carefree, even careless and fanciful, unintimidated self. Sterne wants us to pay attention to both, whatever may be disrespected in the process. One without the other, he suggests, would make for a careworn, uncivil, sensible, humourless, unshandian book, or a hobby horse. Neither the fasting nor the full self are a diversion or a refuge from each other. They are inextricable and mutually enlivening. Attention and its diversions and distraction, Sterne wants us to persuade us, are inextricable, in fact, mutually enlivening. But as Thorne reminds us, hobbies and hobby horses are described conventionally as what he calls divertissements, diversions of the leisured, of the affluent, of the inhabitants of the happy valley. And this is, of course, the traditional topos of sacred and secular moralists. There is what we should be attending to and what we should not be. And we know from Sterne that the wound and the hobby horse also somehow go together, as do the full and the fasting self. And we know from Johnson that vacancies of attention are signs of unease. All morality depends upon knowing where and how to pay attention. And to pay attention to morality is also always to pay attention to attention. So, for example, we're familiar in one of our contemporary languages with the idea that it is trauma that organizes and narrows, that organizes by narrowing attention. Wounds and hobby horses go together, as do wounds and vacancies of attention. And that morality, like hobbies and hobby horses and so-called sexual perversions, can be described as, among other things, a self-cure for trauma, even if that can also just mean the trauma of being desiring creatures. Johnson says in Rasselas, when we are distracted, we are oppressed and impressed by the tediousness of time. When we fob ourselves off with distractions, when we're just keeping busy, we are in fact bored. Attention nourishes us, distraction depletes us. Attention redeems the time. It makes it feel worth living and living out. Good attention makes a good life. With its appeal to so-called experience, this has the reassuring clarity that Sterne, in his more contemporary and perhaps salutary way, warns us away from. To define is to distrust, Sterne says in Tristram Shandy, and we can tell the difference between attention and distraction, between fasting and fullness, but the difference only matters because of the combinations that then become possible. To define may be to distrust, but it also is to make combination possible. It's not the conversion of distraction into good attention that we should seek, in Sterne's view, but the affinities between them. Sterne promotes only the attention that cooperates with inattention, and that's why the difference between them matters. So when and if you promote inattention, what are you promoting? The vacancies of attention in the Happy Valley were for Rasselas the sign of need, the preconditions for change. The vacancies of attention and the tediousness of time to which they lead inspired his curiosity and his necessary escape from the Happy Valley. The preconditions for Tristram's writing are paying the world all possible attention and respect, and also not doing so, as though attention without inattention disables. Johnson and Sterne, that is to say, in their very different ways, are promoting loss of attention and are paying attention to it. They want us to see the provocation of our vacancies of attention. The third and fortunately final section of this paper has an epigraph from Henry Adams, The Education of Henry Adams, and it's a sentence. Some great generalization which would finish one's clamor to be educated. I've used Rasselas and Tristram Shandy as a way of talking about the uses of inattention, but I'm not here, in the words of David Bartholomew, quote, setting out to write intellectual history or tell a story of influence. I want rather to trace a set of common concerns carried by an odd, deep, and persistent vocabulary. I want to use Johnson and Sterne here to show that a line can be drawn, though not, as I say, necessarily one of direct and acknowledged influence, from Sterne and Johnson through to Freud and what became known as the middle group in British psychoanalysis. And particularly then, Marion Milner's interest in what she calls narrow and wide-angled attention. One way of saying this is that Freud had described psychoanalysis as a new kind of treatment based, for both the doctor and the patient, on inattention. A treatment founded on the idea of not, in the traditional way, concentrating. A treatment in which inattention was the instrument, not the obstacle, and for both the doctor and the patient. The psychoanalyst was a physician who listened with so-called free-floating or evenly suspended attention. Quote, he must give no special a priori importance to any aspect of the patient's discourse, and who listened in this way to an unprecedented, freely associating patient who was invited to speak without attending to his words, to speak without needing either to tell a story or to mean what he says, without, insofar as it was possible, choosing his words, quote, selecting nothing and omitting nothing from what comes into his mind. As though Freud is saying, only in states of inattention can certain provocations work. The provocations, that is, of unconscious desire. In Recommendations to Physicians Practicing Psychoanalysis in 1912, Freud writes, quote, just as the patient must relate everything that his self-observation can detect and keep back all the logical and affective objections that seek to induce him to make a selection from among them, so the doctor must put himself in a position to make use of everything he's told for the purposes of interpretation and recognizing the concealed unconscious material without substituting a censorship of his own for the selection the patient has foregone, end of quote. The wrong kind of attention here, the attention that both analyst and patient must suspend, is censored attention. Freud is suggesting here that attention is primarily, if not essentially, always already thoroughly censored, or selective, as we say more blandly. That looking is a way of stopping us seeing, that talking is a way of stopping us speaking, that listening can be a way of stopping ourselves hearing. That what we call attending can be a process of motivated exclusion, that we concentrate and focus in order to occlude and temper what we might see. That attention evaluates, prohibits, and preempts, but often unconsciously, without our as yet being aware of it. Psychoanalysis tracks what attention wants and doesn't want to omit. Freud is wondering what we might attend to and how we might attend when and if the censorship is in abeyance. And this means, paradoxically, what we might be attending to if we stopped paying attention. What we call our attention has been tampered with. So we must avoid, Freud suggests in the same paper, quote, a danger which it is inseparable from the exercise of deliberate attention. For as soon as anyone deliberately concentrates his attention to a certain degree, he begins to select from the material before him. One point will be fixed in his mind with particular clearness, and some other will be correspondingly disregarded. And in making this selection, he will be following his expectations or inclinations. This, however, is precisely what must not be done. In making the selection, if he follows his expectations, he's in danger of never finding anything but what he already knows. And if he follows his inclinations, he will certainly falsify what he may perceive. It must not be forgotten that the things one hears are, for the most part, things whose meaning is only recognized later on. This is Freud's version of the Sufi proverb, don't learn, listen. If we deliberately concentrate our attention, all we discover is our expectations and assumptions and presumptions. These are what we already know. When we concentrate, we can be concentrating on our prejudices. Our so-called knowledge in this version is all assumption, presumption, and preference. Freud offers two prescriptions: suspend deliberate concentration and attention, and allow meaning to take time to emerge. Don't, that is to say, jump to conclusions or think that you know anything other than your assumptions. A certain kind of inattention leads to the right kind of attentiveness. Our all too selective attention feels like second nature, and our selective attention in this version is a protection racket, protecting us from too disturbing a sense of our and other people's desire. Selective attention we might call the will to define, and the will to define we can call the will to exclude. When Sterne writes in Tristram Shandy, to define is to distrust, he's asking us what or who should we put our trust in, and so what we should be attending to. To define, Johnson writes in his albeit definitive dictionary, is, quote, to circumscribe, to mark the limit, to bound, to determine, to decide, to decree. Attention circumscribed, bounded, determined, decided, decreed, with limits marked, is, of course, the project of Freud's ego, as it contends with a concerted disarray of instinctual life. In Freud's story, this is what the ego strives more or less forlornly to do with and to unconscious desire. And this is what makes the ego essentially an author of cock and bull stories. And the ego does this by contriving apparent vacancies and narrownesses of attention. In Freud's story, where there is desire, there's always attention and vacancies of attention. Where there is desire, definition does the work of distrust and containment and reassurance. Attention in the psychoanalytic account is a compromise and is therefore compromising. But the psychoanalyst problem is always to do with the sense in which the analyst always knows what he's looking for. That is to say that it's possible that Freud knows, though he wouldn't of course put it like this, that psychoanalysis as an essentialism becomes part of the problem that psychoanalytic method is intending to solve. Freud believes he knows what man, and to some extent woman, is, and therefore to what we should be paying attention. After all, the psychoanalyst as psychoanalyst also has his expectations and inclinations. The Freudian analyst expects to find primary process thinking, instinctual drive representations, incestuous desire, ambivalence, and conflicts around dependence. He is, as Freud says, quote, in danger of never finding anything but what he already knows, which is why the analyst is so easy to caricature. The analyst, as Freud knows, already knows a lot, and knows a lot about already knowing a lot. How much, given the essentialism he starts from, can his work be, as it were, full of surprises? And if for the most part meaning is only recognized later on, is it recognized once and for all, or in an ongoing and developing way? Or how much later will it be before meaning supposedly emerges? The analyst has to stop deliberately concentrating when the patient speaks, and he has to wait an indeterminate time for meaning to emerge, meaning which by his own lights will always be evolving under the aegis of unpredictable current experience. What Freud is describing is the difference between the kind of attention paid when we know what we want, what we're looking for, and the kind of attention paid when we're finding out what we want, when we don't know beforehand what we want or what we're looking for, but only that we are in a state of wanting and seeking. Attention as instrument and attention as medium. The first kind of attention is intent, determined, and more or less sure of itself, and can be called in psychoanalysis a perverse state of mind. The second kind of attention is more at a loss and uncertain, tentative and provisional. So we can read Freud as he invents psychoanalysis, knowing that he wanted to suspend instrumental attention, but without quite being able to bear, or being unable to formulate in the terms available, not really knowing what he might be looking for, not being able to acknowledge desiring without a discernible object of desire. We could describe Freud, in other words, as wanting to find a new way of attending to a newish object of attention, instinctual life in language, but also, and more radically, wanting to find a new way of attending to an indefinable object of attention, and with no definitive or defining purpose in mind. A Freud who wanted to cure his patients, and a Freud who wanted to inquire about something with them. A Freud who both knew the aim and the objects of his attention, and a Freud who did not. A Freud for whom psychoanalysis was akin to a sexual perversion, and a Freud for whom it was whatever the alternatives to perversion might be. And for both revisions and redescriptions of attention were required. There was a Freud who knew what he should be paying attention to, and a Freud who knew that knowing what you should be paying attention to was a way of not paying attention. Freud, as essentialist, wants to effectively convert us to what in his view man is. Freud, the anti-essentialist, has, like all anti-essentialists, nothing to convert us to except to anti-essentialism. And those who wish to convert us always know what we should pay attention to, and often exactly how we should be paying that attention. So when Marion Milner wrote of narrow and wide attention before she became a psychoanalyst in her first book, A Life of One's Own, she was in a sense picking up where Freud left off, whether she knew this or not, or picking up where Freud started. As part of her experiment in finding and making what she calls a life of her own, she realized that she needed what she refers to as two kinds of attention, wide attention and narrow attention. We should perhaps bear in mind here that wide in slang means wily, and immoral, narrow also means bigoted. Narrow attention, which as a first way of perceiving, Milner writes, quote, seemed to be the automatic one, the kind of attention which my mind gave to everyday affairs when it was left to itself. You attend automatically to whatever interests you, whatever seems likely to serve your personal desires. But I could not find anywhere mentioned what seemed to me the most important fact about it, that this kind of attention has a narrow focus. By this means it selects what serves its immediate interests and ignores the rest. As far as I could see, it was a questing beast. This attitude was probably essential for practical life, so I suppose that from the biological point of view, it had to be one which came naturally to the mind. End of quote. As a questing beast, that from the biological point of view came naturally, narrow attention has in Milner's Darwinian account adaptive advantages. It serves immediate interests, apparently knowing what these are, but because it ignores everything else, it has a narrow focus, like the expectations and inclinations Freud warns the analysts away from. And it is the wider focus, which may or may not be in the service of adaptation, that Milner is now interested in. Wide attention, what she calls her second way of perceiving, is to do with wanting nothing, and with wanting nothing as the way she discovers that wanting preempts experience. This wanting forecloses the discovery of what you might want. And two kinds of attention bring two kinds of provocation. The provocations we know we're looking for and the unsuspected provocations. The aim of psychoanalysis, Winnicott once remarked, is to enable the patient to surprise themselves. In this sense, narrow attention is for essentialists, for the people who, because they know who they are, know what they want. It gradually occurred to me, she writes, quote, that expectancy might be an obstruction to one's power of seeing, particularly active in the sphere of emotion. Wide attention, she writes, quote, seemed to occur when the questing purposes were held in leash. Then, since one wanted nothing, there was no need to select one item to look at rather than another. So it became possible to look at the whole at once, to attend to something yet want nothing from it. These seem to be the essentials of the second way of perceiving. I thought that in the ordinary way, when we want nothing from any object or situation, we ignore it. But if by chance we should have discovered the knack of holding wide our attention, then the magic thing happens. End of quote. The magic thing that happens is the shock of the new. Wide attention is in the best sense amenable to distraction. When at last I did recognize this obstruction to my view, she writes, the obstruction being the wanting, the knowing what you want, then I was able, at least sometimes, to sweep all ideas away from my mind so that immediately real experience, new and indescribable, flooded in. It is in apparently ridding herself of preconceptions that are an omniscience about wanting, that immediately what she calls real experiences become possible, indescribable because new and not previously formulated. The questing beast is converted into a kind of mystic through a change of attention. Something is released and comes flooding in like an orgasm, but unlike because unexpected, unsuspected, uncalculated. A change of attention is a change of experience. But everything depends for Johnson and Sterne, for Freud and Milner, on the relationship between wanting and attention. It is Milner's project to also try and disentangle attention from desire and to see where it leaves us. And this frees her to ask the question that psychoanalysis was previously unable to ask. What happens to attention when we take wanting out of the picture? And what happens to the picture? Thank you. If anybody would like to ask a question, do, but the answers will be jet-lagged.
Hi, thank you so much. This is the dreaded, not a question, but a comment. But it truly just is a comment. You said in your paper that Johnson was the only great writer to produce a dictionary, yes? I would just add, and maybe this was the qualification you intended, Wittgenstein, who we talked about so much earlier, also wrote a dictionary. That may not make him a great writer for you, but so much of the talk was, I thought, in conversation with what we had earlier. And Wittgenstein wrote for his students in Austria a spelling dictionary that is still in print. Just a curiosity.
Thanks so much for your talk. I have two questions. I'm not sure if they're related. So attention for Freud, so my understanding is that he uses several words in German for attention, and I would be really curious to know whether you can differentiate them, because I think they have very different meanings. And the other is about hobby horse, and I'm not sure that I thought it was really fascinating, but so I was thinking about the multiple levels of meaning or possible meaning around hobby horse, one being sort of historical, the other being, so the sort of theatricality, and the other being around play, the hobby horse, like you can buy at the toy store. I'm just curious whether you intended a kind of play with those multiple registers.
The first version of the paper had quite a long passage about the history of the word hobby horse, which it sounds like you know is very interesting and extraordinary. Because certainly, for example, in the 18th century, a hobby horse was a prostitute. But also, hobby horse was one of the things that maypole dancers did in the 15th century. I mean, in other words, it has an extraordinary history of being to do with a combination of pagan ritual, illicit sexuality in a certain sense, and a certain kind of play, unofficial play. So when Sterne picks up the word and uses it in a very specific way, which I think tends to be the way we, whoever we are now, use it, I think he's delimiting it very much. And I think the history of the word's very interesting in this regard. I think you, unlike I, don't read or speak German, so I'm sure you're right that it has many different uses, but I'm using the English translations. And so I imagine that attention must take many forms in the original German text, but I'm free not to know that.
Thanks so much. I was wondering, in this framework of wide versus narrow attention that you were talking about at the end of the paper, the broad, free-floating, open attention characterized, but the wide versus the narrow attention that knows what it wants, I think you said. What would we do with monomaniacal attention? So I'm thinking of the sort of attention that is not, it doesn't know what it wants necessarily, but when it finds something, laser focuses on it. I'm thinking of the protagonists of Poe's Berenice and The Telltale Heart as good examples of this. But what do we do with that kind of attention? Is it wide, is it narrow, is it something else?
I think I can only answer this in a kind of psychoanalytic way, but the kind of story that I would tell would be something like this, that initially, whenever that is, there is unorganized desire, there's sort of want, let's say. And the question becomes whether and to what extent and in what ways any individual can bear their frustration. Because if there's an extreme intolerance to frustration, one will be very quick to locate an object of desire and, as it will, have it. And in a way, what I think one of the things that psychoanalysis probably promotes one way or another is the idea that actually it's only through patient frustration, as it were, that an object of desire can really emerge, whatever really might mean in that sentence. So that an anxiety state would generate either a grasping after objects of desire that are kind of ersatz objects, or a compulsive addictive desiring. In other words, the project would be to narrow the mind in relation to desire, for fear of either the multiplicity of desire or the doubts about desire, the guilts about desire. But I think I think the reason I use perversion in this is not, as it were, moralistically, but so much as to describe, because for me, I think a perversion would be simply, a perverse state of mind would be one in which one knew exactly what one wanted. So it would be absolutely non-experimental, and in that sense, non-experiential as well. So I think somebody, and it could be Lamb, but anyway, somebody says that the reason that Hamlet clearly isn't mad is that he's got lots of ideas rather than one. And, in a way, you could think that the extreme fixity of mind or the extreme fixity of attention would be one of the ways in which people are prone to diagnose some kind of something being very wrong with someone. Marion Milner says on Not Being Able to Paint, if you want to paint a tree in a field, look everywhere but at the tree. Because once you start looking at the tree, all you'll see is the tree. Whereas if you look at everything else, the sort of environment around it, you will then get a sense of what the tree could be. And it's a very interesting other way of looking at things, and clearly it's kind of psychoanalytic.
So I think, am I up? So thank you. I have a question. So the way, I heard you speaking about the vacancy and or the relationship between attention and inattention was in terms of a kind of simultaneity, and I'm wondering how time would fit into this, or a certain temporality, and the state I thought of was boredom. And what does one do with being bored? I know you wrote about this, but being bored as a form of inattention or attention.
Winnicott describes depression as the fog over the battlefield. In other words, it's an attempt to suppress what is felt to be an unbearable conflict in a kind of vagueness. I think that you could imagine boredom as something similar, that when a certain conflict about desire becomes unbearable, boredom takes over. That'd be one way of describing this. So either boredom is not knowing what one wants and the vagaries of that, or boredom is actually the terror of knowing what one wants and what that will then involve one in. I think that there must be a sense in which, I assume, that in states of boredom, it's not as though desire can ever really be absent. So I think the question is always, what's being done with the appetite at any given moment? So when I'm bored, I'm either, in this version, determinedly withdrawing attention from the nature of my desire, or I'm trying not to know what it is I might want, because the consequence of the wanting is so problematic. So I think boredom would be like a holding pattern, would be one way of describing it. And it would be an attempt to be inattentive in a stultifying way.
Yeah, the reason I'm saying, relating this to temporality is because in German, boredom is Langeweile, and it means a long time. So it's the perception of time being eternal.
Well, it's a very strange, I don't know if this does right to what you just said, but it's a very strange thing, which is that people will often say in psychoanalysis, not only in psychoanalysis, but nothing ever is changing. Nothing's changing. When, in fact, everything's changing at every second psychobiologically. So presumably, there's an unwillingness to perceive change, not its absence. So the temporality, this does kind of matter.
So just a quick question. This is on, right? The essay, the recommendations for physicians that you quoted from Freud.
Do you mean remembering, repeating, working through?
The one where he describes evenly suspended attention and the dangers of a form of psychoanalytic attention that is going to presume, already know what it's looking for. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because ultimately the feeling, I suppose, that it left me with was this anxiety about inattention, a sense that one has to be ever vigilant, that one hasn't fallen into attention. So this sort of paradox and just the difficulty of something that seems like you're supposed to be mindless about, and yet you have to be kind of ever vigilant about.
Winnicott wrote a paper that you may know called On the Capacity to be Alone. And in that he says that the child's capacity to be alone depends upon having been alone in the presence of the mother. And the supposition here is that if the child knows that the mother is in some way present, the child doesn't have to hold him or herself. So that vigilant self-holding turns up when there's an anxiety about an absence of care. And it makes logical sense it would. So in a way, I think one of the things that, in a way, psychoanalysis starts with what is in fact the problem. You know, Francis said the patient isn't cured by free associating, the patient is cured when he can free associate. So that instead of sort of mothering oneself with one's mind, i.e. being in a state of vigilant, whatever it is, conscious attention, one might be able to relinquish that and then see whatever else it is that one might feel. But to do that, you'd have to feel that it was contained by some body somewhere.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I actually also have a question about the recommendations essay, and I was just hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on the distinction between attention as medium and attention as instrument, because I guess I was paying attention to the vacancy in the quote that you read out, because my favorite part of that essay is when Freud says that the analyst has to essentially become like a telephone receiver to the patient who is the microphone. I mean, it's like a really bungled metaphor, but it's wonderful. And the telephone is an instrument that can also function as a medium, or is it a machine? And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that.
In a way, your question, the example answers the question, because in the image of the phone, Freud's talking about unconscious communication. Now, when attention is an instrument, it is as though one is attending with a view to finding something that one already knows about. When it's a medium, it is something in which something can happen. So when I'm talking about Freud talking about attention being a medium, it's as though the quality of the mutual attention going on allows for or facilitates people feeling and thinking differently or otherwise or surprisingly. So it's the difference between something being found and something being discovered in a certain sense, or something being found as opposed to something being invented. So that when attention is a medium, you have no idea what might turn up, and not literally no idea, but you have a limited idea of what might turn up in it. Whereas when it's an instrument, you do sort of know.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much for the talk. I just had a question about the pretty brief invocation of trauma in the talk, and I was just wondering if the emphasis on knowing what to pay attention and what not to pay attention in that case requires something less than wide, or if it's not necessarily the form of selective instrumental attention, that it somehow requires an attentiveness that you would articulate differently than the wide attention.
The thing about, I mean, I'm sure you know this, but the thing about attention is that, in relation to trauma, is that trauma incites the attention that then obliterates. So trauma is the experience you can't attend to, effectively. And in the psychoanalytic story, trauma is something you only ever have after you've had it, because there isn't an it to begin with. There's just, as it were, the absence of something. I mean, it's a bit like, there's a thing in child development which used to be called stranger anxiety. At 8-month-old, children begin to experience strangers. Now, the original idea was they are experiencing strangers. It looks as though actually what they're experiencing at 8 months is not mother. So in other words, they're experiencing an absence of something, not a presence of something else. Well, I think that's one kind of analogy for a traumatic experience, which is you're experiencing the absence of something. And it might take a lot of time, I think probably the kind of attention that comes through conversation probably, in order for this to be conjured or reconjured or rethought or reconstructed. But to begin with, it's as though trauma would be narrow attention, and recovery, if we can talk in this sort of language, would be wide-angle attention. Because once you can allow yourself wide-angled attention, it's as though you're sufficiently unfrightened not to be worried about what you might see. Whereas the point about narrow attention, it regulates fear.
Yeah, I actually had in mind from the perspective of the analyst or the therapist, but
Just say another sentence about that then.
well, is the attention required by the analyst in treating trauma? What I said before,
Yeah, well,
narrower than wide, but
Well, I
not
think
narrow.
in a way it may be the same point, which is it depends on what you, the analyst, can bear. Because the thing is that your analysis depends on your analyst's past, if you see what I mean, obviously. And you can never know beforehand what you're walking into in an analysis, because you're both walking into your analyst's past, which is only partly known to them, and you're walking into a whole series of presuppositions and theories about what people are and so on. But I think ultimately it comes down to what the analyst can bear to hear, or to experience, not only hearing, but to experience. And that will set implicit limits to what can be said, as in ordinary relationships.
Thank you very much. I had well, I just want to elicit a comment from you on this more than I don't have a well-formed question. But one of the things I was wondering was around this issue of dawning of an aspect in Wittgenstein.
Of what?
Dawning of
Yeah,
right? And I'm kind of always thought it very interesting when in one of the sessions Bjorn describes how, as the patient is talking, he can see the words moving to the wall and making patterns on that wall. And I'm wondering whether, in a way, then the kind of knowing is really not the knowing of what these words are, but what this person is in relation to these words, and whether that, in a certain sense, plays with this dawning of an aspect, because I precisely can't make it appear. I mean, it can only appear out of some grace or something.
And that, Bjorn says this in the tradition he writes in, which is that, certainly in Kleinian psychoanalysis, the question would be, what is the patient doing to you with their words? That the words are not simply objects of meaning, so to speak, they're also objects. They could be missiles, they could be all sorts of weapons or gifts or seductions or whatever. But that the idea being that in a way, the patient's language is not simply to be decoded in terms of meaning. And so in a way, this is why those analysts are interested in countertransference, because really they are listening for what the patient's words evoke in them, not what the patient's words mean. So Leo's example today with the Lacan thing is very interesting in that regard, because you could think at that moment something was evoked in Lacan. Now, after the fact, it can be explained in a certain sense, but of course, no psychoanalytic training suggests that whenever there's a verbal ambiguity, the analyst enacts it, obviously. If that film was used as a training vehicle in trainings, the question would be, what was it teaching anybody? Which is, it seems to be a genuinely interesting question. I don't mean this entirely facetiously. Because I think that when you're thinking about what's non-verbal in analysis, and an awful lot of it, of course, is non-verbal or pre-verbal or whatever, you're talking about evoked states of mind, which have about them a great deal of uncertainty. Because on the one hand, you could think everything you think and feel in the presence of another person is a function of that relationship. Or you can think, no, actually, it's much more separate than that. That people are having their separate thoughts and feelings which every so often overlap. Whereas in a kind of field theory, it doesn't matter who says what, because there's just a group of two.
Hi, Adam. You made me think about something I hadn't really thought about a lot before, which was, it sort of explains why one thing this sort of middle group never really do is diagnose anybody. Freud did a bit, but they never do. And yet, a patient coming for therapy or just people who are in trouble that you meet, one thing they really want is a diagnosis. And it's a kind of knowledge that people think will help them. So just there's a sort of practical question about what does the middle group sort of do instead of diagnose, which still gives people something?
Well, the short, glib answer would be they hold their patients, not physically, but I mean the patients feel sufficiently held. But I think that what would be analysed would be the wish for a diagnosis, if you see what I mean, because that in itself would be revealing of a lot of things about a certain kind of, well, on the one hand, verbal fixity and the magic of words and so on, and the belief in the authority of the other person. I think that, I mean, certainly my experience is, and I'm sure not only me, is that the longer you speak to somebody, the more the diagnostic categories dissolve, obviously. Now, the diagnostic categories can be useful, you know, they can be indicative. The problem is it's a very instrumental view, because the idea is the reason you have a diagnosis is so there is a treatment. So on the basis of the medical model, if you do a psychological diagnosis, you then know what you then do with the patient. Well, of course, in psychoanalysis, nobody can tell you what to say when. It isn't like that. And I think that my sense of the middle group is that they are interested in these fictions as allegory. They're like allegorical characters, obsessionals, hysterics, and so on. And they're useful to that extent. But that were you to abide by them, you'd be abiding by them because you were so frightened of the patient, you'd need to invest in your own authority.
Well, it might be time for a reception. Okay, well, let's thank Adam.
Thank you.